The sky wasn't supposed to look like that. Not in May. Not over this part of the New Mexico territory, where the winds blew gently through the cottonwoods and the sun bathed the sandstone cliffs in peace. But on that evening, just as the cattle were being led back to the pens and the last rays kissed the roofs of the settlers' cabins, the sky turned red, deep and unnatural, like a warning painted by the gods themselves. Elizabeth Carter stood on her porch, her bonnet in one hand, her rifle in the other, heart pounding like the war drums she'd only heard in rumors. Her children clung to her skirt, silent. They had learned not to cry. The sound had started with thunder, only there were no clouds. Then came the horses, too many to count, hooves like a storm across the dry earth. A band of outlaws, not soldiers, not even men with a cause, just men with fire in their eyes and greed in their hearts. The sheriff was gone, disappeared 3 days ago. Her neighbors had already locked their doors, and some had fled. She knew they wouldn't come to help. And her husband lay in a shallow grave not 50 paces from the barn. She thought of praying, but even the church had been burned down the month before. That's when she saw him. A silhouette on horseback, standing still at the crest of the canyon like something carved from stone. Long dark hair braided with feathers, a red sash at his waist, bow in hand, eyes scanning the valley like a hawk before the strike. He did not belong to the settlers, nor to the raiders. He belonged to something older. Navajo. She'd heard tales of warriors who walked between the worlds of the earth and sky. Men who didn't speak much, but who could silence war with a single gesture. She had never believed them until now. The raiders didn't see him yet, but she did. And something in her heart that had been clenched for weeks suddenly loosened. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was friend or phantom. But the moment she saw him raise that bow, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to die tonight. The first arrow flew so fast it seemed the wind itself had delivered it, straight into the throat of the lead raider before he could even raise his torch. Chaos erupted as the horses reared and men screamed, but the warrior did not move. He stood high and still, framed by the dying sun like a spirit called forth by the land itself. Then he stepped forward, into fire, into war, into the heart of the impossible. Elizabeth watched in disbelief as he descended the hill alone, each step sure, his face emotionless, but eyes burning with something deeper than anger. He wasn't fighting for revenge. This was something sacred. The raiders, thrown into confusion by the sudden death of their leader, scrambled to form a line. They had numbers, over 20 men armed with rifles, blades, and bloodlust. He had a bow, a knife, and the trust of the earth. The second arrow caught a man trying to flee. The third was dipped in something. Elizabeth would later learn it was snake venom, and it paralyzed the one who caught it in the leg. By the time the raiders began to fire their rifles, he had vanished like smoke. "Is he gone?" her son whispered. Elizabeth couldn't answer. Her heart was racing, her grip on the rifle slick with sweat. But then the warrior reappeared behind the raiders, like a shadow come to life. He took 2 more down with blades too fast to see, and the others turned on each other in panic, unsure if this was man or myth. In a breathless minute, he had turned their strength into fear. And yet, he never once looked toward the settlers, never once sought thanks or protection. He fought as if the land itself had asked him to. One of the outlaws tried to flee toward the Carters' cabin. Elizabeth raised her rifle, her hands trembling, but the warrior's arrow found him first. He turned then, his eyes locking with hers for the first time. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture. No words passed between them, but in that single look, Elizabeth understood. He wasn't done. And the real storm had yet to begin. The sun had vanished now, and in its place, the dim hush of twilight fell over the land like a cloak hiding the worst of what had just happened. Smoke from the raiders' torches mingled with the desert air, the stench of fear and blood now clinging to the dust beneath Elizabeth's boots. Her children were inside, silent, staring wide-eyed at the door. She remained outside, clutching her rifle, staring at the stranger who had become their only reason to keep breathing. He walked among the bodies now, not with cruelty, but with reverence. Every fallen man, he checked. Those still clinging to life, he left untouched. Those who had died in cruelty, he covered with dust. It was as if he wasn't just a warrior, but a keeper of balance, of law older than any court. He moved like he knew this land, like it whispered to him. Then she saw it, the blood running down his side. He was wounded, not badly, but enough. He hadn't flinched during the fight, not once. But now, the weight of it seemed to pull at his limbs. Elizabeth stepped forward. "Wait," she called, unsure if he'd even understand her. He turned slowly, his bow still in hand, but relaxed. Up close, he looked young, perhaps 30, but his eyes were ancient, worn like the river stones behind her property. "You're hurt," she said. He looked down at the wound as if it were someone else's body, then back at her. "I have herbs," she added, trying to steady her voice. "Clean water, too." He nodded once, no words, just that same quiet nod. She led him to the porch where she boiled rainwater and cleaned the cut. He did not flinch, only watched the horizon as if more trouble might ride in at any moment. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He looked at her then, the firelight catching the high angles of his cheekbones. "Tazhi," he said. She didn't know the meaning, only that it sounded like strength. When she finished binding the wound, he stood. "They will return," he said simply, "stronger." And just like that, he turned to leave. "Wait," Elizabeth said again, voice sharper this time. "Why did you help us?" He paused. "Because this land is not theirs to ruin." Then he vanished into the dark, and all that was left was the sound of horses breathing and blood drying on the dust. The following days passed like fragile glass, quiet, tense, and ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Elizabeth repaired the cabin door herself, hammering planks with blistered hands while her children gathered firewood under a nervous sun. Every shadow made her flinch. Every gust of wind felt like hooves on the horizon. But Tazhi did not return. Not that first day, not the second. And yet, he was everywhere. Tracks too careful to be animals circled the property at dawn. A piece of salted meat left beside their well, wrapped in bark. An arrow, finely carved, placed on the windowsill while they slept. He was watching, guarding, but from where, Elizabeth couldn't guess. At night she'd sit by the fire, her children asleep, and listen to the wind. It no longer sounded empty. It whispered now, stories she could barely understand, stories of an older justice. Then, on the third evening, the settlers gathered at the church ruins. Word had spread of the attack, and of the man who saved the Carters. Some called him a savior, others, a threat. "We don't know what side he's on," said Martin Keller, the blacksmith, as his hands trembled around a rusted pistol. "He could bring more trouble than those raiders." Elizabeth stood slowly. Her voice cracked, but her eyes did not. "He risked his life, while the rest of you bolted your doors." Murmurs spread, but the truth hung in the air like smoke. No one had come to help her that night. No one but him. Still, doubt festered. The settlers feared what they didn't control, what they didn't understand. A few spoke of alerting the army post, of reporting the presence of a hostile Navajo warrior. Elizabeth clenched her jaw. That night, as she returned home, she found him waiting at the edge of the field, under the shadow of a juniper tree. "They fear you," she said, stepping close. "Not because of what you did, but because they saw something they couldn't match." Tazhi didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a leather pouch. Inside were tiny, carved stones, each marked with symbols she didn't recognize. He placed one in her palm. "Protection," he said. "Keep it close." Then, once again, he disappeared into the wind, as if he were more legend than man, and Elizabeth wondered if she had ever truly seen him at all. It happened on the 5th night. The air had turned colder than it should have for spring, and the sky wore a sickly hue, like something bad was waiting just beyond the mountains. Elizabeth had tucked her children into bed and sat sharpening the kitchen knife by lantern light when the dogs began to howl. Not bark, but howl, long and broken like a funeral chant. She ran to the door and felt it in her bones before she saw it, the beat of hooves, distant but coming fast, and the unmistakable crackle of flame being fed too eagerly. They were back. The raiders. But this time they weren't scrambling or desperate. This time they came in formation, torches raised high, rifles at the ready, and hatred twisting their faces into masks of something less than human. Elizabeth's hands moved on their own, grabbing her rifle, bolting the door, whispering prayers she no longer believed in. The cabin shook as gunfire echoed down the valley. Screams followed. Neighbors this time. The raiders had widened their hunt. She looked out the window and saw the Wilson barn already aflame, horses stampeding loose into the dark. She didn't think. She couldn't afford to. She ran to the children, waking them with a trembling voice and clutching them close. "We're going to the root cellar," she said, more to herself than them. "Stay quiet. Don't come out unless I say so." They obeyed, too scared not to. Then she turned, rifle in hand, and braced herself behind the cabin door. A torch hit the porch. The flames licked toward the roof. Her breath caught. She was going to die here. That's when the wind changed. It came sharp from the west, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and ash. And something else. A war cry. High and piercing. Not from fear, but from fire inside the soul. Then he was there. Tazhi. Like the wind had carried him, he rode in from the darkness on a pale Mustang, eyes locked on the leader of the raiders. He didn't wait. No commands, no warning, just fury. The first shot missed him, but the second didn't. He took it in the shoulder but didn't fall. He rode harder, and behind him, more riders. Navajo. Not an army, but enough to turn the night. Enough to make the devils retreat. The dawn crept over a valley soaked in smoke and silence. The fires had been stamped out with dirt and prayer, and the raiders had scattered like rats chased by wolves. But the cost of survival hung in the air like mourning cloth. Bodies littered the fields, some raiders, some settlers, all stained by the same red earth. Elizabeth moved through the wreckage like a ghost, numb, barely feeling her own feet beneath her. Her children were safe, the cellar untouched, but the guilt of surviving clung to her like soot. Then she saw him. Tazhi lay beneath the twisted remains of a burnt fence, blood matting his hair, his left arm useless and his chest rising in shallow gasps. She dropped to her knees. "Don't you dare die," she whispered, voice cracking, hands pressing against his wound. "Not after everything." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locked on hers. "Is it done?" he rasped. Elizabeth nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "They ran. You made them run." He exhaled, and it sounded like he was letting go of centuries. She helped him up slowly, every movement a silent scream of pain, and led him back to her cabin, step by excruciating step. The settlers watched from a distance, some in shame, others in awe, but none dared interfere. Inside, she cleaned him again, this time with hands that trembled less. As she stitched his shoulder, she asked, "Why do this? Why fight for people who'll never thank you?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at the wooden ceiling, eyes full of storms. "Because my grandfather's bones lie beneath this land," he said finally. "Because even if they hate me, I won't let them poison what we all belong to." His voice was soft, but each word felt carved in stone. That night, Elizabeth sat beside him until the fire burned low. Outside, the settlers buried their dead and repaired their fences, but no one came to thank the man who had saved them all. When she finally fell asleep in the chair beside him, he reached for the small carved stone he had given her and placed it back in her hand. "Still yours," he whispered, before closing his eyes and surrendering to rest. And for the first time in weeks, the wind outside sounded like peace. By the time the sun had risen 2 full turns, the settlers had gathered again, this time not to pray, not to grieve, but to argue. They met in the burned-out remains of the town square, where charred beams still smoked and the air stank of regret. Tazhi, his wounds wrapped and his strength returning, remained in the Carter cabin, unseen but not forgotten. Elizabeth stood in front of the crowd, her arms crossed, daring them to speak the words they didn't have the courage to say aloud. "He saved this town," she said sharply, louder than she meant to. "My children are alive because of him. Most of you are." "And what if more of them come because of him?" spat Martin Keller, again clutching that same pistol he'd never fired. "What if this isn't over?" "It's not over," Elizabeth snapped. "But not because of him, because of what we allowed. You bolted your doors and hid like cowards. He bled for us." "He's an outsider," another man said, this one from the Miller farm. "He doesn't belong." "He belongs more than we do," she said through gritted teeth. "He didn't run. He fought. And he fought for this land. Not for you, not for me. For the land, a silence followed. Uncomfortable. Heavy. No one had an answer for that. The preacher, old and bent but not broken, finally spoke. "If a man defends your home, he earns the right to walk it." His words hung in the air like a judgment. Still, some faces stayed twisted with doubt, unable to accept a truth that cut deeper than any blade. Back at the cabin, Tazhi sat upright for the first time in days. Elizabeth entered with bread and water, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "They're looking for someone to blame," she admitted. "Some are afraid of you." "Fear is easier than gratitude," he said flatly. "It requires less courage." She sank into the chair beside him. "Why stay?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where smoke still lingered from a burned barn. "Because the land is still bleeding," he said, "and I was taught you don't walk away from your wounded." His words settled between them like sacred scripture. He was not a hero in search of glory. He was a guardian tied to something no counsel could see, and no hatred could destroy. 3 days after the second attack, a storm rolled in from the west, not one of thunder or rain, but of horsemen in blue coats, sabers at their sides and orders in their mouths. The U.S. Army had arrived. News had reached Fort Defiance of the settler massacre, and they had come not to help, but to assert control. The officer in charge, Captain Ellis, was a hard-faced man with a mustache like a wire brush and eyes that did not blink. He rode straight to Elizabeth's cabin, trailed by 6 men on horseback and 2 wagons heavy with supplies and weapons. "We heard about the raid," he said without greeting, "and we heard about the Indian." Elizabeth met his stare without flinching. "He has a name. Tazhi." The captain dismounted, dusting off his coat as if the land itself had stained it. "We're taking him in. Questioning. For everyone's safety." "Everyone's?" she asked bitterly. "He's the only reason half this town is still breathing." "That's not for you to decide," Ellis said coolly. "You're harboring a tribal warrior on disputed land. That makes you complicit." Behind her, the children watched from the window, their eyes wide with fear. Tazhi stepped out before she could speak again. He stood tall despite his wounds, his back straight, his face unreadable. "I'll go," he said quietly. "No," Elizabeth snapped, stepping in front of him. "They'll twist this, use you to scare others." "I've faced worse," Tazhi replied. "They can't make me a villain unless I give them reason." Ellis nodded to his men. "We'll need your weapons." Tazhi pulled the bow from his shoulder and the knife from his belt, placing them gently in the soldier's hand. Not as surrender, but as witness. Ellis ordered him into the wagon. As they bound his wrists, not roughly but like it was routine, Elizabeth reached out and touched his arm. "I won't let them erase what you did here," she whispered. Tazhi gave her a look she would never forget. Part sorrow, part pride. "They cannot erase what lives in the land," he said. "Only bury it for a while." Then the wagon creaked forward, rolling through the broken town as faces watched in silence. And above them, clouds gathered, not of rain, but of reckoning. They locked him in a small stone room beneath Fort Defiance. No window, no mat, just walls stained with old rain and rusted iron. Days passed. They fed him little and spoke even less. No trial was held. No charges were read. To the soldiers, his guilt was in his skin and silence. He had stood too tall, fought too well, made them question who the real enemy was. Captain Ellis came each day, trying to provoke him. "How many did you kill before the raid? Where did you learn to fight like that? Who trained you?" But Tazhi gave no answers. His silence was not weakness, it was defiance. Meanwhile, back in the valley, Elizabeth refused to let his name be buried. She stood before the settler council again, this time with her children beside her. "You want safety," she told them, "but you punish the man who gave it to you. What kind of people are we if we hand over our protector and call it justice?" A few nodded, hesitant but ashamed. Even the preacher wept quietly. That night she rode to the fort alone, a letter clutched in her hand, signed testimonies from every family Tazhi had saved. Ellis met her at the gate. "Your loyalty's admirable," he said, smirking, "but misguided." "You don't scare me," she said. "You can't cage truth. You can't rewrite what happened here." "Truth?" he laughed. "This territory belongs to the United States, and the United States decides what's true." "Then truth must scare you more than war," she whispered. The next morning, without announcement, they released him. No apology, no explanation. Just shoved his belongings into his arms and opened the gate. He walked out barefoot, head high, and found her waiting at the edge of the camp with a fresh pair of boots and water. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I did," she replied. "Because they will forget. They'll rewrite what happened. But not me. Not my children." He looked at the sun rising over the valley, the very earth that had soaked in their blood and sacrifice. "The land remembers," he said. "It always does." Together they rode back, not as saviors or survivors, but as something more rare. Those who carried the weight of truth, even when no one else wanted to. The valley had changed. The smoke had cleared, the fences were rebuilt, and the cabins stood straighter than before, but the people, oh, the people carried a weight they didn't yet understand. Children played quieter. Men who once barked orders now nodded respectfully. And women who had clutched fear like a shawl now spoke of bravery not found in guns, but in the eyes of a Navajo warrior who had faced death for those who barely knew his name. Tazhi did not stay. He never planned to. A week after his release, he stood again at the Carter doorstep, the rising sun behind him, his Mustang saddled. Elizabeth opened the door with the baby on her hip, her older two rushing to greet him. He knelt to ruffle their hair gently, his eyes soft for the first time. "You don't have to go," Elizabeth said, though she already knew he would. "There's room here for people who matter." He smiled faintly. "The land calls me elsewhere." She handed him a small cloth pouch, dried food, salve, and a carved stone of her own, one her children had made. "So you don't forget us," she whispered. "I won't," he said, tucking it near his heart. "But this place doesn't need me anymore. It needs to learn to stand for itself." As he rode off, the town gathered silently at the road's edge. No cheers, no parades, just a long moment of silence broken only by the wind. Then one of the settlers, a quiet man who had never spoken in public before, stepped forward and placed a single arrow in the dirt. Others followed. A horseshoe, a feather, a carved cross, not gifts, not apologies, symbols, signs that they'd seen, they'd changed, that they remembered. Elizabeth watched until he disappeared into the canyons, swallowed by light and dust. Her children asked if he was coming back, and she said what she believed in her bones. Not soon. But someday. And long after they were grown, the story of the warrior who defended them against impossible odds would pass from lips to campfire, etched not just in memory, but in the very soil of the land he refused to abandon. He was not a myth. He was not a ghost. He was a man who walked like a storm and left behind peace. And where his boots touched earth, legends were born.